The best way to grow your show is to be a really good show host and speak to a niche audience. I am sure you're not surprised to hear this. And you may be like, but what about all the tactics that the bigwigs use? They're really good show hosts who speak to a niche audience. That's the tactic. Hey, it's Christine again, owner of Worthful Media, on our show host series on our YouTube channel. I'm so glad you're here. I really am going to answer your frequently asked questions this year on this series. So subscribe. And if you haven't checked out the previous videos, they are there for your binging delight. Today, I am talking about a question I get so often from show hosts. Oftentimes, these are people who have already been hosting their show for over a year. So if that's you, pay special attention. But even if you haven't started a show yet, this will be relevant. And I'm about to tell you why. The number one question I get casually from people who find out I'm a podcast and YouTube producer for personal brands, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is the question that comes out of their mouth if they've already had a show for like a year or so. They're like, how do I grow my audience? What are the tactics? What should I be doing on social media? What are the strategies? What's the secret sauce? And I love answering this question because it usually takes people by surprise, or they kind of nod knowingly and they're like, yeah, I think I already knew that, but it's good to hear from an expert. And here's the answer. The best way to grow your show is to be a really good show host and speak to a niche audience. I am sure you're not surprised to hear this. And you may be like, but what about all the tactics that the bigwigs use? They're really good show hosts who speak to a niche audience. That's the tactic. And here's why it may feel counterintuitive or like, wait, are you serious? Like there's, I have a bunch of budget towards marketing. Like, what do you do with it? Well, here's the truth. Podcasting, and I'm going to give kind of two answers here, because if you've been hosting a podcast on audio apps, it's a different growth strategy than if you're hosting a YouTube show. So I'm going to answer the podcast question in this video because we'll have plenty of other videos about YouTube. But to be fair, YouTube already is pretty open about how to grow a channel on YouTube. Like, that's not rocket science. Like, you can research it and do the work. You can hire a consultant. Like, it's pretty clear how to grow a channel on YouTube. A podcast sometimes feels murkier, especially to personal brands who aren't first podcasters and then have businesses. Our clientele are business owners who podcast and YouTube to market their offerings. So I'm always working with people who already have existing brands and offerings and services and expertise and are known for something, and then they choose to podcast. So that's why this question comes up so often, because they're not committed enough. And this is probably you watching, so I'm speaking to you. You're probably not committed enough to being a podcast or a YouTube host to like make it your full-time thing, right? Maybe that's a dream of yours. You're like, yeah, I would love to have a media-based sponsor-supported company. And that's awesome. Keep subscribed to the show because I've worked on those shows. I know how they work. I know how to get you there. It's a long road, by the way, but it could be worth it for you. But my clientele, and who's probably subscribed to the channel, is someone who already is like well established in some other thing, like they're really good at another thing, and then they fall in love with podcasting and YouTube. It's a way to share what they love and know with way more people than they could ever get paid to help or connect with. It also is really, really good marketing for obvious reasons. So when I get this question from personal brands who happen to be show hosts of podcasts, we're getting really niche here, but you probably want to know if you are this person. I do have custom answers for everyone because I ask them questions. I'm like, okay, tell me about your audience. Tell me about your goals. Tell me about your product offering. Tell me about the maturity of your audience. Tell me about your show. Tell me about how you've shared it. Like, I go through a whole list of specifications because that's going to inform how I would advise someone. If someone's already done a bunch of like entry level first year stuff, I'm not going to tell them to go do that. But if they skipped doing the basics that they should have done at the beginning, this isn't like a judgment thing. It's just like, oh, in your first year, here's all the best practices. Like, did you do them? And maybe you were never told to do that and you never learned. So like, awesome, go ahead and do all these. But if you're already there and you've already done it for a year and you're like, okay, my audience is sort of plateaued, I want to keep growing it. How do I do that for an audio podcast? The answer is, in simple words, be a really good show host to a niche audience. And here's why this can take people off guard. And it may feel like, what, Christine, like that's so basic. What are you talking about? Well, here's what I often find. When a show host tells me their show growth has plateaued and they're a personal brand, I'm like, oh, tell me what kind of content you make. Like, tell me about the topics of your episodes. Tell me about who you're talking to. And they typically give me like a pretty general answer. I'm not kidding. 9 times out of 10, they'll see something like, oh, well, I really love talking about like self-development, mindset, success, some health and wellness. I love talking about relationships. I invite people on the show who are like leaders in their space. I kid you not, I get an answer so often. And all these show hosts supposedly have very different brands and very different offerings, and yet they'll say the same thing when I'm like, yeah, tell me about your show. Like, if you're doing the same thing that thousands of other small scale personal brand shows are doing, literally, why would anyone who isn't already a fan of you listen? Like, that's not a judgment on you. Just like, why would they ever even know who you are? Because they can hear you, they can hear the same people interviewed on all the other shows that are interviewing leaders and success stories in self-development, health and wellness, entrepreneurship. And it doesn't mean it's bad content. And it doesn't mean that like you're not creating a great show, but nothing about that show is differentiating you to attract a niche audience who doesn't already know who you are. You following me here? So the answer to the question is like, what's the best way to grow my audience after I've been podcasting for a year and I'm a personal brand, is either niche much more focused on specific topics for a specific audience so that you can really corner that audience and become known as like the best show in that specific niche, or it's just become a lot better show host. And that is not because you're a crap show host right now, but you probably aren't as good as you could be because you have so many other priorities in your life, right? You're probably running a business, or you're freelancing, or you're looking for gigs, or you're maybe employed full time and you're doing the show on the side, and you have a life and relationships and family and health. Like, being a show host is not your number one priority, but it's actually the longest lever that will attract a bigger audience to you. And so I know it feels a little counterintuitive, but when I get this question, I just do a little question asking, and then I'm like, yeah, like you could decide to become a much better show host, or you could just speak to a much more niche audience. And both of those would grow your audience a lot quicker than any social media tactic or any blah, 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 SEO, email marketing strategy. Like, I always share the best practices of like, yeah, make sure to do this, 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 and this, and this. And it's all the same stuff you probably already know if you've researched this. But after that, the actual lever will be being a better show host or speaking to a more niche audience. Now, obviously, there's other things that help, like being really consistent, communicating effectively. Like, those are sometimes things that have like fallen by the wayside if you've been into it for a year and you're like, oh, I'm kind of getting fatigued, and is this worth it? And you have other priorities because you're human. Like, maybe you have fallen off your consistency, or maybe your messaging and communications kind of gotten lazy or slow because like it just wasn't a priority. Like, those are easy fixes. You know how to do that. Like, get back on the wagon, you know, like if you want to grow your audience, be consistent, message effectively. There's all sorts of great stuff. But when I'm talking about the longest lever and the most effective way to grow your audience if you've hit a plateau as an audio first podcast, qualifier, be a better show host and speak to a more niche audience. And you will probably already know just from watching this video which one resonates for you, right? Like, you probably knew immediately when I said both those options, which one was the right one for you. Because sometimes I say that to someone and they're like, I know in my core being focused on a more niche audience is not going to get me to where I want to go. And I'm like, awesome. If you know that and you know your 5 to 10 year goals and it's not niching down, you don't have to do that. It would grow your show quicker. But like, if that's not a niche you want to commit to, then like, don't do it. Duh. But let's say you've never actually considered that. Let's say you were just kind of enthused about trying out being a podcaster and you just kind of cast a wide net and talked to a bunch of people and covered a lot of topics. but you've realized like all the questions from your audience consistently come in around one specific subset of topic that you constantly share, well, I would really niche down on that. And I would do a whole season of the show on that. And I would dig deeper and kind of fall in love with it and really build an audience relationship where you're serving that niche. That will literally grow your show a lot quicker, because it's so much easier for people to recommend your show when it's a specific show they can sum up in a sentence that's really niche, right? Think about it. Like when people recommend shows to you, isn't that like how they say it? It's like, let's say I was recommending The Illusionist, hosted by Helen Zaltzman. Huge podcaster, independent, awesome, amazing, been around forever, very successful show. If I was going to tell you to go listen to The Illusionist by Helen Zaltzman, I'd be like, oh my gosh, this brilliant English woman breaks down the etymology of words and she's so funny and clever and I always learn something new. Like, you're probably going to go look up The Illusionist right now with Helen Zaltzman, because that was like so easy for me to recommend it. If it was a lot broader than that, it would be a lot harder for me to recommend it, right? Like, I work on so many great shows, and a lot of them have like similar guests or topics. And so it would be hard for me to recommend a specific one to you without having a niche for me to reference. If you were like, hey, I really need to listen to a show that's going to help me with this specific thing, that would really help me reference like even shows that I work on. But if you're just like, what are some of your favorite podcasts? It would be a lot harder for me to reference a whole bunch of the same kind of show, right? So that's kind of the magic of niching down and why it grows an audience fast. On the other option, becoming a better show host, for obvious reasons, makes your show grow, because you actually become way better at your craft and you're much more enjoyable to listen to. And that may feel like a little like, oh, like vulnerable, or like, well, how do I become a better show host? But like, that's actually something you can do, right? Like, you can control being a better show host. And if you realize, like, thinking about it, like, I do not want to put any more work into being a better show host, that's fine, but that's probably an answer to a bigger thing. Like, maybe hiatus your show for a while until you find a reason to pick it up again and want to be better. And if you realize like, oh my gosh, you're right, Christine, like, I could be a way better show host. I haven't put in nearly as much energy and focus as when I started and was learning a lot. Like, fall back in love with it. Like, hire a production team to train you, or take a class, or listen to a bunch of really well-rated podcasts and really like break down and study what those show hosts do. Truly, like, that's what the homework I give a lot of our clients. Like, when we define what their show is and they're like, I really want to be a good show host. I'm like, okay, go listen to this person, this person, and this person, and report back like what you learned. Like, you can learn from other show hosts, but the most important thing here is obviously like, be true to yourself, be honest with yourself. Like, what do you have bandwidth for? What are your priorities? What have you tried? What have you not? But that's really the longest lever. If you want to grow your show and you have an existing one and it's kind of plateaued, become a better show host or niche down your topic. And those will grow the show so much quicker than any other tactic. Okay, that's the tip for today. Subscribe to the channel, because I am going to be sharing a lot of tips about how to be a better show host on the channel this year for free. They are here for you. And if you're curious about what type of show host you are, and you're maybe aren't 100% sure in your personal brand, like, what show host would I be best suited as? We have a free quiz and you can take it. It takes 30 seconds. The link is in the video description. And that's a great place to start if you're just trying to orient, like, how do I put my natural strengths to work as a show host to become better? Take the quiz. It's very revelatory. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.